In the small town of Cedar Falls, Montana, where everyone knew everyone else's business, Sophia Reynolds stood 6 feet 4 inches tall in her bare feet. At 26, she had grown accustomed to the whispers that followed her down Main Street, the sideways glances in the grocery store, and the cruel jokes that echoed through the local diner. But nothing could have prepared her for what would happen when a 7-foot Cherokee man named Thomas Blackhorse walked into her life and changed everything forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Cedar Falls as Sophia Reynolds made her way to Miller's hardware store, where she had worked for the past 3 years. Her long stride carried her quickly past the usual cluster of gossiping townspeople who gathered outside Mabel's cafe each morning like clockwork. "There goes the giraffe," she heard Martha Henderson whisper to her companion, followed by a burst of muffled laughter. Sophia's jaw tightened, but she kept walking. She had learned long ago that responding only gave them more ammunition. Cedar Falls was the kind of place where tradition ran deep and change came slowly. Founded in 1887 by cattle ranchers and railroad workers, the town had maintained its small-town charm and equally small-town mentality. For a woman like Sophia, who towered over every man in town except for old Pete Morrison, who ran the gas station, fitting in had always been an impossible task. The hardware store's bell chimed as she pushed through the door, and her boss, Frank Miller, looked up from behind the counter. Frank was a decent man in his 50s who had given Sophia a job when no one else would, but even he sometimes looked at her with a mixture of pity and bewilderment. "Morning, Sophia," he said, adjusting his glasses. "We've got a big delivery coming in today. Some fellow bought up half our lumber supply for a construction project up north." Sophia nodded and tied her apron around her waist. She had strong hands and a good head for numbers, which made her invaluable in the hardware business, even if the customers sometimes did double takes when they saw her helping them load 50-pound bags of cement into their trucks. The morning passed quietly until around 10 o'clock, when a massive shadow fell across the front windows of the store. Sophia looked up from the inventory sheet she was updating to see a figure approaching the entrance that made her breath catch in her throat. The man who entered Miller's hardware store was unlike anyone she had ever seen. He stood at least 7 feet tall, with broad shoulders that seemed to fill the entire doorway. His long black hair was pulled back in a traditional braid, and his weathered face spoke of years spent outdoors. He wore simple work clothes, worn jeans and a flannel shirt, but there was something about his presence that commanded immediate respect. Frank Miller's mouth fell open slightly as the giant of a man approached the counter. Can I help you?" "I'm Thomas Blackhorse," the man said, his voice deep and resonant. "I called yesterday about the lumber order." "Right. Yes," Frank stammered, shuffling through his papers. "That's quite a lot of wood you're buying, Mr. Blackhorse. Building something big." Thomas nodded, but didn't elaborate. His dark eyes swept across the store, taking in the neat rows of tools and supplies before they landed on Sophia. For a moment, their eyes met, and she felt something she had never experienced before, the strange sensation of looking up at someone instead of down. "I'll need help loading the truck," Thomas said, his gaze still on Sophia. "If you have someone available." Frank glanced nervously between Thomas and Sophia. "Well, Sophia here is our strongest worker, but I can help," Sophia interrupted, stepping forward. She had grown tired of people speaking about her as if she weren't in the room. Thomas nodded once, a hint of what might have been approval crossing his features. "I'd appreciate that." For the next 2 hours, Sophia and Thomas worked side by side, loading lumber onto his massive pickup truck. He didn't make conversation, but he treated her like an equal, something that was so rare. It almost brought tears to her eyes. When she lifted a particularly heavy beam, he didn't rush to help her or make comments about women not being suited for such work. He simply worked alongside her, their movements falling into a natural rhythm. "You're building something substantial," Sophia observed as they loaded the last of the 2x4s. "A house," Thomas replied simply, "for your family." Thomas paused, securing the load with practiced efficiency. "For someone who deserves better than what she's been given." Before Sophia could ask what he meant, Thomas climbed into his truck and drove away, leaving her standing in the parking lot with more questions than answers. The rest of the day passed in a blur of speculation. Word spread quickly through Cedar Falls about the giant Cherokee man who had bought enough lumber to build a small fortress. By evening, the local diner was buzzing with theories and gossip. "I heard he's some kind of criminal hiding out in the mountains," said Betty Crawford, the town's self-appointed keeper of rumors. "Nonsense," replied Doc Harrison, the elderly physician who had delivered half the babies in town. "Cherokee people have been in these parts longer than any of us. He's probably got every right to be here." Sophia sat alone at a corner table, picking at her meatloaf and trying to ignore the conversations swirling around her. She had chosen the corner booth because it was the only one where her legs fit comfortably, but it also meant she heard every whispered comment and cruel joke. "Speaking of giants," Martha Henderson said loudly enough for the entire diner to hear, "maybe our resident beanpole finally found herself a match." The laughter that followed was sharp and cutting. Sophia felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but she forced herself to finish her meal before standing to leave. As she walked toward the door, the conversations died down, replaced by the uncomfortable silence that always followed her departure. Outside, the night air was cool and filled with the scent of pine from the surrounding mountains. Sophia walked slowly toward her small apartment above the bookstore, her mind replaying the day's events. For the first time in her adult life, she had worked alongside someone who made her feel normal-sized, and the experience had been both thrilling and unsettling. Her apartment was sparse but clean, with high ceilings that Frank Miller had specifically modified when he rented it to her. She had few visitors. Her height made entertaining awkward, and most people in town preferred to keep their distance anyway. As she prepared for bed, Sophia found herself wondering about Thomas Blackhorse. There had been something in his eyes. When he looked at her, something she couldn't quite identify. Respect, perhaps, or recognition. Whatever it was, it had made her feel seen in a way she hadn't experienced since childhood. The next morning brought unexpected drama to Cedar Falls. Sophia arrived at work to find Frank Miller pacing behind the counter, his face flushed with agitation. "What's wrong?" she asked, hanging up her jacket. "That Cherokee fellow," Frank said, wringing his hands. "He's caused quite a stir." Sophia's heart sank. "What kind of stir?" "Mayor Caldwell got wind of his building project and sent the city inspector up to his property. Turns out he doesn't have the proper permits. They've ordered him to stop construction immediately. But he just bought all that lumber yesterday." "That's not the worst part," Frank continued. "Harold Caldwell is telling everyone that we can't have outsiders coming into our town and doing whatever they please. He's calling for a town meeting tonight." Sophia felt a surge of anger that surprised her with its intensity. She barely knew Thomas Blackhorse, but the idea of the town ganging up on him simply because he was different struck too close to home. The day dragged by slowly, with customers coming in primarily to gossip about the Cherokee giant and his mysterious building project. Each conversation made Sophia more uncomfortable as the underlying prejudice became increasingly obvious. "I don't care if his people were here first," she overheard Bob Patterson telling his friend. "This is our town now, and we have rules." By closing time, Sophia had made a decision that would have shocked anyone who knew her. She'd always been the type to keep her head down and avoid conflict, but something about Thomas Blackhorse's situation had awakened a sense of justice she didn't know she possessed. That evening, Cedar Falls Community Center was packed for the hastily called town meeting. Mayor Harold Caldwell, a short, pompous man with a receding hairline and an inflated sense of his own importance, stood at the front of the room addressing the crowd. "We can't have people coming into our community and ignoring our laws," he was saying as Sophia slipped in through the back door. "Property values, safety concerns, the character of our neighborhood, all of these things are at stake." Sophia found a seat in the back row, her height making it impossible to remain inconspicuous. She noticed several people turning to stare at her, their expressions ranging from curious to hostile. "What exactly is he building that has everyone so concerned?" asked Mrs. Patterson from the middle of the crowd. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." "That's just it," Mayor Caldwell replied. "Nobody knows. He won't say, and he refuses to get the proper permits. For all we know, it could be some kind of compound or illegal operation." The crowd murmured its agreement, and Sophia felt her anger rising. She had seen the lumber Thomas purchased. It was clearly for residential construction, nothing sinister or unusual. "Maybe we should ask him directly," she found herself saying, her voice carrying clearly across the room. The entire gathering turned to look at her, and she felt her courage wavering under the weight of their collective stare. Mayor Caldwell's face reddened as he focused on her. "Miss Reynolds," he said with barely concealed irritation, "I don't think you understand the complexity of this situation." "I understand that you're making assumptions about someone you've never spoken to," Sophia replied, standing up to her full height. "And I understand that this town has a history of being unwelcoming to people who are different." An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Everyone knew what she was referring to, the years of whispers, jokes, and cruel comments that had followed her throughout her life in Cedar Falls. "This isn't about being different," Mayor Caldwell said dismissively. "This is about following the law. Then why not help him get the proper permits instead of trying to run him out of town?" Before anyone could respond, the community center door opened and Thomas Blackhorse walked in. The room fell completely silent as he made his way down the center aisle, his presence seeming to fill the entire space. He walked directly to the front of the room and turned to face the crowd. "I hear you've been discussing me," he said simply. Mayor Caldwell cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Blackhorse, we were just expressing some concerns about your building project." "What concerns?" "Well, the permits, for one thing, and the fact that nobody knows what you're building." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes surveying the room. When his gaze found Sophia in the back row, something passed between them, a moment of understanding that made her pulse quicken. "I'm building a house," Thomas said finally, "for someone who has been treated poorly by this community for far too long." The crowd began to murmur among themselves, speculation running wild about who he might be referring to. Sophia felt her cheeks burning as several people turned to look at her with knowing expressions. "As for the permits," Thomas continued, "I'll get whatever paperwork you require. But I want to make something clear. I'm not going anywhere, and neither is my project." With that, he turned and walked back down the aisle, stopping briefly when he reached Sophia's row. "Would you like to see what I'm building?" he asked quietly. Sophia nodded, not trusting her voice to work properly. She followed Thomas out of the community center, leaving behind a room full of shocked and whispering townspeople. The drive to Thomas's property took them up into the foothills of the Rockies, along winding dirt roads that Sophia had never traveled before. His truck was large enough that she actually felt comfortable in the passenger seat, another new experience that she found both strange and wonderful. "How long have you lived in Cedar Falls?" Thomas asked as they drove. "All my life," Sophia replied. 26 years of being the town freak." "You're not a freak." The simple statement, delivered without emotion or pity, hit her harder than any elaborate compliment could have. She turned to look at his profile in the dim light from the dashboard. "What made you decide to build here?" Thomas was quiet for so long that Sophia thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "My grandmother used to tell stories about the tall white woman who would come to our reservation. She was a teacher who worked with Cherokee children in the 1940s. The other white people thought she was strange because of her height, but our people respected her because she treated everyone with dignity." Sophia felt her throat tighten. "What happened to her?" "She married a Cherokee man and lived on the reservation until she died. My grandmother said she was the happiest person she ever knew because she finally found a place where being different was valued instead of mocked." They drove the rest of the way in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. When they finally reached Thomas's property, Sophia gasped in amazement. Even in the moonlight, she could see the skeleton of what would clearly be a magnificent house. The frame was already substantial, built with the lumber she had helped him load just the day before. But it wasn't just the size that took her breath away. It was the attention to detail, the craftsmanship that was evident even in these early stages. "You're building this yourself?" she asked. Thomas nodded. "With my hands, the way my father taught me, the way his father taught him." As they walked around the construction site, Thomas explained his vision. The house would have high ceilings. Throughout, wide doorways and custom-built furniture scaled for people of above-average height. There would be a workshop where he could continue his woodworking and a large kitchen designed for someone who actually enjoyed cooking. "It's beautiful," Sophia said, and she meant it. "But Thomas, who are you building it for?" He stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight. "For you, Sophia Reynolds, if you'll have it." Sophia's world tilted on its axis. She stared at Thomas in the moonlight, certain she had misheard him. The mountain air felt thin in her lungs as she struggled to process his words. "I don't understand," she whispered. Thomas stepped closer, his massive frame casting a shadow that somehow made her feel protected rather than intimidated. "I've been watching you, Sophia, not in a strange way, but I've seen how this town treats you, how they make you feel small despite your height." Her hands trembled as she wrapped her arms around herself. "You don't even know me." "I know enough." His voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "I know you work harder than anyone at Miller's Hardware. I know you're kind to the children who stare at you in the grocery store instead of getting angry. I know you eat alone at that corner table in the diner because it's the only place your legs fit, and I know you pretend not to hear when they call you names." Tears stung Sophia's eyes. The fact that someone had noticed, really noticed, the small details of her daily humiliation was almost more than she could bear. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" she asked. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the skeletal frame of the house. "My wife died 3 years ago," he said finally. "Cancer. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, but she had the biggest heart of anyone I've ever known. Before she passed, she made me promise something." Sophia waited, afraid to breathe. "She said that if I ever found someone who was hurting the way I hurt when I was young, someone who was rejected for being different, I should help them if I could. She said loneliness was the worst kind of pain, and that people who understand that kind of suffering have a responsibility to help each other." "You were rejected for being different." A sad smile crossed Thomas's weathered features. 7-foot Cherokee men don't exactly blend in anywhere, Sophia. Not on the reservation, not in the white world. I spent most of my childhood being stared. Just like you. The difference is, I found someone who loved me exactly as I was. You haven't had that chance yet." The implications of his words hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Sophia found herself studying his face in the moonlight, searching for signs of pity or condescension, but finding only genuine understanding. "This is insane," she said finally. "You can't just build someone a house because you feel sorry for them." "I don't feel sorry for you." Thomas's voice carried a note of steel. "I respect you. There's a difference." Over the next several weeks, Cedar Falls buzzed with speculation about Thomas Blackhorse and his mysterious building project. The fact that he had obtained all the necessary permits with remarkable speed only added fuel to the gossip fire. Mayor Caldwell, clearly frustrated by his inability to legally block the construction, had taken to making pointed comments about outside influences and maintaining community standards. Sophia found herself caught in the middle of it all. At work, customers would pump her for information about Thomas, assuming she knew more than she was letting on. The truth was, she hadn't seen him since that night at the construction site, and his absence left her feeling strangely hollow. She had replayed their conversation 1,000 times, trying to make sense of what had happened. A man she barely knew had essentially proposed to build her a house, and she had fled like a frightened deer. The memory of her hasty retreat still made her cheeks burn with embarrassment. "You're distracted today," Frank Miller observed, as Sophia miscounted the same inventory sheet for the 3rd time. "I'm fine," she replied automatically. Frank studied her with the knowing look of a man who had raised 3 daughters. "You know, in all the years you've worked here, I've never seen you look at a man the way you looked at Thomas Blackhorse." Sophia's head snapped up. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means maybe you should stop running from something that might be good for you." Before Sophia could respond, the bell above the door chimed, and Thomas himself walked in. He moved with the same quiet confidence she remembered, but there was something different about him today. A determination that made the air in the store feel charged with electricity. "Sophia," he said simply, "we need to talk." Frank cleared his throat and suddenly found urgent business in the back room, leaving them alone among the aisles of tools and supplies. "I know you're scared," Thomas said without preamble, "and I know this whole situation seems impossible, but I need you to understand something. I'm not going away." "Thomas, you can't just build a house for a woman I barely know?" He smiled, and the expression transformed his entire face. "I've been thinking about that. You're right, it is crazy. So let me propose something different." Sophia waited, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Come work for me. I need help with the construction, and you're the strongest person I know. We'll spend time together, get to know each other properly. If after the house is finished, you decide you want nothing to do with me, I'll sell it and move on. But at least give us a chance to see what this could be." The offer was so unexpected, so perfectly reasonable, that Sophia found herself nodding before she had fully processed what he was asking. "I'll need to give Frank proper notice," she said. 2 weeks?" 2 weeks. Thomas's smile widened, and for the first time since childhood, Sophia felt like someone was genuinely happy to have her around. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity. Word spread quickly through Cedar Falls that Sophia Reynolds was leaving Miller's Hardware to work for the Cherokee giant, and the gossip mill went into overdrive. "I always knew she was strange," Martha Henderson told anyone who would listen, "but taking up with that savage is beyond the pale." The racist undertones that had lurked beneath the surface of the town's disapproval finally emerged in full force. Sophia found herself the target of increasingly hostile stares and whispered comments. Someone left a note on her car windshield calling her a traitor to her own kind. Another person spray-painted "Squaw Lover" on the side of the bookstore, where she lived. The harassment reached a crescendo on her last day at Miller's Hardware. A group of local men, led by Mayor Caldwell's son Derek, confronted her as she was locking up the store. "You sure you know what you're doing, Sophia?" Derek asked, his voice dripping with false concern. "That India's got you all turned around, doesn't he?" "My personal life is none of your business, Derek," Sophia replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "See, that's where you're wrong." Derek stepped closer, and Sophia could smell alcohol on his breath. "This is a small town. What affects one of us affects all of us. And having our women taken by outsiders, well, that affects all of us. I'm not your woman, Derek. I'm not anyone's woman." Derek's face twisted with anger. "That's right, you're not. You're a freak who's so desperate for attention that you'll spread your legs for the first savage who shows you any kindness." The slap came so fast that Derek didn't have time to duck. Sophia's palm connected with his cheek with a sharp crack that echoed off the storefront windows. The men with him took a step back, shocked by the sudden violence. "Don't you ever speak to me like that again," Sophia said, her voice deadly quiet. "And if I hear you've been spreading lies about Thomas or me, I'll do more than slap you." She walked away before Derek could respond, her legs shaking with adrenaline and fury. Behind her, she could hear him cursing and his friends trying to calm him down. She knew she had just made an enemy, but she found she didn't care. For the first time in her life, she had stood up for herself and for someone she cared about. The next morning, Sophia drove up the mountain road to Thomas's property with her few belongings packed in the back of her small car. He had offered to let her stay in a cabin on his land while they worked on the house, an arrangement that was both practical and scandalous by Cedar Falls standards. The cabin was small but comfortable, with a stone fireplace and large windows that looked out over the valley below. Thomas had clearly put effort into making it welcoming. There were fresh flowers on the table, food in the refrigerator, and towels in the bathroom. "This is beautiful," Sophia said as Thomas showed her around. "It belonged to my grandfather," he explained. "I've been fixing it up. The ceilings are a little low for you, but it's perfect," Sophia interrupted. "It's the first place I've lived where someone actually thought about what I might need." They spent the rest of that first day working side by side on the house frame. Thomas was a natural teacher, patient and encouraging, as he showed Sophia how to read the plans and use the tools. She discovered that she had an aptitude for construction work that surprised them both. "You've got good hands," Thomas observed, as Sophia perfectly measured and cut a piece of trim. "And a good eye for detail. I always liked building things when I was a kid," Sophia admitted, "but nobody ever thought to encourage it." As the days turned into weeks, they developed a comfortable rhythm. They would start work at sunrise, break for lunch under the shade of a large pine tree, and continue until the light began to fade. In the evenings, they would sit on the cabin's porch, talking about everything and nothing while the stars came out overhead. Sophia learned that Thomas had been married for 15 years to a woman named Maria, a teacher who had worked with Cherokee children. They had tried to have children but were unsuccessful, a fact that still caused Thomas visible pain when he spoke about it. "She always said we were meant to help other people's children instead," Thomas told her one evening. "Maybe she was right." "You would have been a good father," Sophia said quietly. "Maybe. What about you? Did you ever want children?" Sophia was quiet for a long moment. "I used to dream about it when I was younger, but then I started thinking about what it would be like for a child to have a mother like me. The stares, the comments, the constant explanations. It seemed cruel to put a child through that. Children adapt," Thomas said gently, "and they love unconditionally. Maybe that's something to consider." As the house began to take shape, so did their relationship. It wasn't a romance in the traditional sense. There were no grand gestures or passionate declarations. Instead, it was built on shared labor, quiet conversations, and the gradual recognition that they understood each other in ways that went beyond words. The house itself was a marvel of craftsmanship and thoughtful design. Every room had 9-foot ceilings, every doorway was wide enough for 2 people to pass through comfortably, and every piece of built-in furniture was scaled for people of above-average height. Thomas had designed a kitchen with counters at the perfect height for Sophia to work without bending over, and a living room with a couch where she could sit with her legs stretched out completely. "I've never seen anything like this," Sophia said one day, as they installed custom-built kitchen cabinets. "It's like you've thought of everything." "I want you to be comfortable," Thomas replied simply. "I want you to have a place where you never have to apologize for who you are." The statement hung between them, heavy with implication. They had been carefully avoiding discussions about the future, focusing instead on the immediate work at hand. But as the house neared completion, the question of what came next became unavoidable. The catalyst came in the form of an unexpected visitor. Sophia was working alone on the front porch. Thomas had gone into town for supplies when a car pulled up the dirt road. She recognized the vehicle immediately. It belonged to her only living relative, her Aunt Patricia from Billings. Patricia. Reynolds was a thin, sharp-faced woman who had never approved of Sophia's condition, as she called it. She climbed out of her car with the purposeful stride of someone on a mission. "Sophia Marie Reynolds," she said without preamble. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" "Hello, Aunt Patricia," Sophia replied, not stopping her work on the porch railing. "What brings you all the way out here?" "You know perfectly well what brings me here. The whole family is talking about how you've taken up with some Indian and are living in sin in the mountains." Sophia set down her hammer and faced her aunt. "I'm not living in sin. I'm working and I'm staying in a separate cabin." "Don't split hairs with me, young lady. You've always been different, but this is beyond the pale. Your mother would be spinning in her grave if she knew what you were up to." The mention of her mother, who had died when Sophia was 12, hit like a physical blow. Patricia knew exactly which buttons to push to cause maximum damage. "My mother loved me exactly as I was," Sophia said, her voice tight with emotion. "Your mother worries about you constantly. She knew you'd have a hard time finding a decent man willing to overlook your irregularities. But she never imagined you'd throw yourself at the first savage who showed you attention." "Get off this property," Sophia said, her voice deadly. "Oh, quiet. I'm trying to help you," Patricia continued, oblivious to the danger she was in. "It's not too late to come to your senses. You can come back to Billings with me, find a nice job, maybe meet someone appropriate. Get off this property!" Sophia's shout echoed across the mountains, causing a flock of birds to take flight from a nearby tree. Patricia took a step back, finally recognizing the fury in her niece's eyes. "You're making a mistake," Patricia said, retreating toward her car. "Mark my words, Sophia, this will end badly for you." As her aunt's car disappeared down the mountain road, Sophia sank onto the porch steps, her hands shaking with rage and hurt. She was still sitting there when Thomas returned an hour later. He took one look at her face and set down his bags of supplies. "What happened?" Sophia told him about the visit, about the cruel words and the threats. Thomas listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with each detail. "She's wrong," he said finally. "About all of it." "Is she?" Sophia looked up at him, with eyes full of pain. "Maybe I am just a desperate freak who's fooling herself into thinking this could work." Thomas knelt in front of her, his large hands covering hers. "Look at me, Sophia." When she met his eyes, she saw something there that took her breath away. It wasn't pity or sympathy or even kindness. It was love, pure, uncomplicated, and absolutely certain. "I love you," he said simply. "Not because you're tall, not because I feel sorry for you, not because you're convenient or available. I love you because you're strong and brave and kind. I love the way you concentrate when you're working and the way you laugh when something surprises you. I love that you stood up to those men in town, and I love that you trust me enough to let me build you a home." Sophia felt tears streaming down her face. "Thomas, I know it's fast, and I know it's complicated, but some things don't need time to be true. Will you marry me, Sophia Reynolds?" The proposal came without fanfare, without a ring or bent knee. It was offered quietly, honestly, by a man kneeling in the sawdust of a construction site, and it was the most beautiful moment of Sophia's life. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." When Thomas kissed her, it was the first time anyone had ever had to bend down to reach her lips. And in that moment, surrounded by the house he had built with his own hands, Sophia finally understood what it felt like to come home. The engagement changed everything, though not in ways Sophia had expected. Word of Thomas's proposal spread through Cedar Falls like wildfire, carried by the well-meaning but loose-lipped mail carrier who had seen Sophia's aunt leaving the mountain property in obvious distress. Within 24 hours, the town had divided into two camps: those who viewed the engagement as a romantic triumph against the odds, and those who saw it as a betrayal of everything Cedar Falls stood for. Unfortunately, the second group was considerably larger and more vocal than the first. Doc Harrison was among the few who offered genuine congratulations when Sophia came down from the mountain to buy supplies at the general store. The elderly physician had always treated her with kindness, and his weathered face broke into a genuine smile when he saw her. "About time someone recognized what a treasure you are," he said, loud enough for the other customers to hear. "That young man of yours has good sense." But Doc Harrison's approval was overshadowed by the open hostility Sophia encountered elsewhere. At the grocery store, cashier Jenny Walsh refused to make eye contact while ringing up her purchases. The pharmacist, Mr. Coleman, claimed to be out of her regular headache medication, despite the fact that she could see the familiar bottles lined up on the shelf behind him. Most painful of all was the reaction at Miller's Hardware, where she had stopped to buy specialized screws for the house's custom cabinetry. Frank Miller, the man who had given her a job when no one else would, could barely bring himself to speak to her. "I'm disappointed in you, Sophia," he said quietly as he tallied her purchases. "I thought you had more sense than this." "More sense? Than what, Frank? Than being happy?" Frank's face reddened. "More sense than to throw your life away on someone who's using you for his own purposes." "What purpose would those be?" "Think about it," Frank said, leaning across the counter. "He shows up out of nowhere, finds the loneliest woman in town, and suddenly he's building her a house. Men like that don't do things without expecting something in return." Sophia felt as though she'd been slapped. "Men like what, Frank?" Frank had the grace to look embarrassed, but he pressed on. "You know what I mean. His kind. They're not like us, Sophia. They have different ways, different expectations. His kind." Sophia's voice was dangerously quiet. "You mean Cherokee people? I mean outsiders, people who don't share our values." Sophia carefully placed her money on the counter and picked up her bag of screws. "The only person in this conversation who doesn't share my values is you, Frank. You can keep the change." She walked out of Miller's Hardware for the last time, her head held high, despite the tears threatening to spill down her cheeks. Behind her, she could hear Frank muttering something about ungrateful and making her bed, but she didn't turn around. Some bridges, once burned, weren't worth rebuilding. The drive back up the mountain felt like an escape from a world that had never wanted her anyway. As she pulled into Thomas's property, she could see him on the roof of the house, installing The last of the cedar shingles. Even from a distance, the sight of him working steadied her nerves. "Rough trip to town?" Thomas asked when she climbed the ladder to join him on the roof. "How did you know?" "Your face has that look it gets when someone's been particularly cruel." Sophia settled beside him, grateful for the solid warmth of his presence. From the roof, she could see for miles across the valley, the town of Cedar Falls looking small and insignificant in the distance. "Frank thinks you're using me," she said without preamble. Thomas's hands stilled on the shingle he was nailing. "Using you for what?" He didn't specify, but the implication was clear enough. "Are you having second thoughts?" Sophia turned to study his profile. There was no anxiety in his voice, no desperation or pleading, just a calm acceptance that made her love him even more. "No," she said firmly. "But I think we need to talk about what happens next." Thomas set down his hammer and gave her his full attention. "What do you mean?" "I mean the wedding. Where we'll live, how we'll support ourselves, whether we'll have any friends left in this town." Sophia gestured toward Cedar Falls. "Half the people down there think I'm a traitor, and the other half think I'm a fool. That's not going to change just because we get married." "Does that bother you?" Sophia considered the question seriously. "It hurts," she admitted, "but it doesn't change anything. I'd rather be happy and alone with you than miserable and accepted by them." Thomas reached for her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. "We won't be alone. I have family on the reservation, people who will welcome you, and there are others like us, people who don't quite fit in the regular world. We'll find our community." "What about work? How will we live?" "I've been thinking about that." Thomas's voice took on an excited note. "There's a growing market for custom furniture and cabinets. Rich people in Billings and Bozeman are willing to pay premium prices for handcrafted work. I could start a business, maybe even teach others the traditional techniques." "You mean Cherokee woodworking methods?" "Among other things. There's a whole movement of people wanting to reconnect with traditional crafts, native and non-native alike." Sophia felt a spark of excitement. "I could help with the business side, bookkeeping, customer relations, marketing. We'd make a good team. We already do." They spent the rest of the afternoon planning their future, the conversation flowing easily between practical concerns and wild dreams. By evening, they had sketched out the beginnings of a business plan and decided on a wedding date, 3 weeks from Saturday, just after the house would be finished. "Where do you want to get married?" Thomas asked as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "Honestly, right here, in our house, with the people who actually care about us. That might be a very small guest list." Sophia laughed. "Quality over quantity." The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Sophia was in the kitchen area of the house, installing the last of the cabinet hardware, when she heard a car approaching. Through the window, she could see a beat-up pickup truck making its way up the mountain road. Thomas emerged from the workshop he had been building behind the main house, a frown creasing his features. "I wasn't expecting anyone." The truck stopped near the house, and a woman climbed out. She was small and elderly, with silver hair braided down her back and skin like worn leather. Despite her age, she moved with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable in her own body. "Grandmother," Thomas said, his voice filled with surprise and pleasure. "What are you doing here?" "I came to meet your woman," the elderly woman replied in accented English, "and to see this house everyone's been talking about." Sophia felt a flutter of nervousness as Thomas led his grandmother toward her. She had been dreading this moment, the inevitable meeting with Thomas's family, the judgment that would surely follow. "Grandmother, this is Sophia Reynolds. Sophia, this is my grandmother, Agnes Blackhorse." Agnes studied Sophia with sharp, intelligent eyes. Sophia forced herself to stand still under the scrutiny, fighting the urge to hunch her shoulders or apologize for her height. "You're very tall," Agnes observed finally. "Yes, ma'am, I am." "Good. Thomas needs a woman who can look him in the eye." The simple acceptance in Agnes's voice nearly brought Sophia to tears. After weeks of hostility and rejection, such matter-of-fact approval felt like a gift. "Would you like to see the house?" Sophia asked. Agnes nodded, and for the next hour, Sophia gave her a complete tour. The older woman examined every detail, with the practiced eye of someone who understood both craftsmanship and the importance of a well-designed home. "This is good work," Agnes said finally, "but it's more than just a house, isn't it?" "What do you mean?" Sophia asked. "It's a statement, a declaration that you exist, that you deserve space in this world." Sophia felt her throat tighten. "I never thought of it that way." "Buildings are always statements," Agnes said matter-of-factly. "The question is whether they're statements of fear or statements of hope. This house is definitely hope." That evening, Agnes shared stories around the fire. Pit Thomas had built in the backyard. She told them about the old days on the reservation, about the grandmother who had raised Thomas after his parents died in a car accident, about the traditions that had been passed down through generations. "Love doesn't always look the way people expect it to," Agnes said, as the fire crackled between them. "Sometimes it's quiet and grows slowly. Sometimes it hits like lightning. But real love, the kind that lasts, is always built on respect and understanding." "Is that what you had with grandfather?" Thomas asked. Agnes smiled, her weathered face softening. "Your grandfather was a giant too, just like you. 7 feet, 3 inches in his bare feet. People used to stare at us when we walked through town. The giant Cherokee man and his tiny wife, but we didn't care. We knew what we had." "What did you have?" Sophia asked quietly. "Everything that mattered. Trust, respect, shared purpose, the ability to make each other laugh even when times were hard, and the knowledge that we were stronger together than we ever could have been apart." 2 weeks later, Agnes returned with a small delegation from the reservation. Thomas's cousin David, a tribal elder named Robert Standing Bear, and a traditional healer named Mary Crow Feather. They came to witness the wedding and, as Agnes explained, to formally welcome Sophia into the family. The ceremony itself was unlike anything Sophia had ever imagined. It took place in the living room of the newly completed house, with traditional Cherokee elements woven together with contemporary vows. Thomas had written his own words, speaking in both English and Cherokee about his commitment to protecting and cherishing Sophia for the rest of his life. When it came time for Sophia to speak, she found herself looking around the room at the small group of people who had become her family. Agnes nodded encouragingly, and Sophia felt the words come from a place deeper than conscious thought. "I spent my whole life trying to make myself smaller," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Trying to take up less space, to be less noticeable, to apologize for existing. But Thomas didn't ask me to be smaller. He built me a house with high ceilings and wide doorways. He made me furniture that fits my body and my needs. He saw me exactly as I am and decided I was worth building a life with." She turned to face Thomas, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I promise to never make myself smaller for anyone ever again. I promise to stand tall beside you, to work hard, to love you completely, and to help you build a life that's big enough for both of us." The traditional Cherokee blessing that followed was conducted in the old language, with Mary Crow Feather calling upon the spirits of the 4 directions to protect the new couple. When it was over, Agnes stepped forward with a gift, a wedding quilt made in the traditional pattern, but sized for a bed that could accommodate 2 very tall people. "Every marriage needs a strong foundation," Agnes said as she presented the quilt. "This will keep you warm through the cold times and remind you of the love that brought you together. As the small group celebrated on the porch of the house Thomas had built, Sophia felt a sense of completeness she had never experienced before. She had found not just a husband, but a family, a community, and a place where being different was not just accepted, but celebrated. The celebration was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching on the mountain road. Thomas tensed, his protective instincts immediately activated. Through the gathering dusk, they could see a convoy of cars and trucks making their way toward the house. "Expecting more guests?" David asked, his hand moving instinctively toward his waist. "No," Thomas replied grimly. "Sophia, get inside." But Sophia had already recognized the lead vehicle. It was Mayor Caldwell's official car, followed by what appeared to be half the town council and several other residents of Cedar Falls. Her heart sank as she realized that their wedding celebration was about to become something very different. "I'm not hiding," she said firmly. "This is our home, and today is our wedding day. If they want to cause trouble, they'll have to do it in front of witnesses." Agnes stepped closer to Sophia, her presence both comforting and formidable. "Cherokee women don't run from fights," she said quietly, "especially not in their own homes." As the vehicles came to a stop and their occupants began to emerge, Sophia squared her shoulders and prepared to face whatever Cedar Falls had brought to her doorstep. She was no longer the scared, lonely woman who had worked at Miller's Hardware. She was Sophia Blackhorse now, and she had a family to protect. Mayor Harold Caldwell climbed out of his official vehicle with the self-important air of a man who believed his authority extended far beyond the town limits of Cedar Falls. Behind him emerged a motley crew of townspeople, including Derek Caldwell, Frank Miller, Martha Henderson, and several members of the volunteer fire department. They approached the house like a poorly organized militia, their faces set in expressions of righteous indignation. "Thomas Blackhorse," Mayor Caldwell called out, his voice carrying the false authority of someone trying to project confidence he didn't feel. "We need to have a word with you." Thomas stepped forward, placing himself between the approaching group and his wedding guests. "This is private property, Mayor. You're not welcome here." "Now see here," Caldwell blustered, pulling out a folded document from his jacket pocket. "I have a court order requiring you to cease and desist all construction activities on this property." Agnes Blackhorse let out a sound that might have been laughter. "White man's papers on Cherokee land," she said loud enough for everyone to hear. "Some things never change." David stepped up beside his cousin, his posture radiating quiet menace. "What's the real reason you're here, Mayor? Because that paper's not worth the ink it's printed on if this is tribal land." Mayor Caldwell's face reddened. "This is American soil, and American laws apply here." "Actually," Robert Standing Bear said, speaking for the first time, "this particular piece of land was never properly ceded in any treaty. It belongs to the Cherokee Nation by right of prior occupation." The legal revelation sent a ripple of uncertainty through the group from Cedar Falls. They had clearly expected to intimidate Thomas and Sophia with official documents and small-town authority, not to encounter a tribal elder who understood federal Indian law. "That's impossible," Frank Miller interjected. "This land's been in white hands for over a century." "Stolen doesn't mean owned," Mary Crowfeather said quietly. "And stolen land can be reclaimed." Derek Caldwell, emboldened by alcohol and his father's presence, pushed forward aggressively. "You people think you can just waltz in here and take whatever you want. Well, this is still America, and we still have rights." "What rights would those be?" Sophia asked, stepping out from behind Thomas despite his protective gesture. "The right to harass people on their wedding day, the right to trespass on private property, the right to be racist bullies." "Don't you dare lecture us about rights," Derek snarled. "You threw away any right to our respect when you betrayed your own kind." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Sophia felt the eyes of both groups on her. The townspeople waiting to see if she would crumble under pressure, Thomas's family watching to see how she would handle her first real test as a Cherokee wife. "My own kind?" Sophia's voice carried clearly across the mountain air. "You mean tall people? Because I've never met another group I belonged to until now." She gestured toward Agnes, David, and the others. "These people welcomed me into their family without conditions. They didn't ask me to change or apologize for who I am. They built me up instead of tearing me down. If that's betraying my own kind, then I'm proud to be a traitor." Agnes nodded approvingly, while several of the Cedar Falls contingent looked uncomfortable. Not everyone in the group had come with malicious intent. Some were simply following the crowd, and Sophia's words were making them question their presence. Mayor Caldwell, sensing his support wavering, decided to play his ace in the hole. "There's another matter we need to discuss. We've received reports of illegal activities on this property. Drug manufacturing, weapons stockpiling, plans for some kind of compound." The accusation was so outrageous that Thomas actually laughed. "Drug manufacturing? With what equipment? Weapons stockpiling? You can search the property right now if you want. You'll find construction tools and wedding cake." "We're not talking about what's here now," Caldwell pressed. "We're talking about what you're planning. Everyone knows your people have a history of violence." The racist assumption finally pushed David over the edge. He stepped forward, his considerable height and obvious physical fitness making several of the townspeople step back nervously. "My people," David said, his voice deadly quiet, "have a history of defending themselves against people exactly like you. People who show up with papers and guns and lies, claiming they have the right to tell us how to live." "Are you threatening us?" Derek demanded, trying to sound brave, but failing to hide the tremor in his voice. "I don't make threats," David replied. "I make promises, and I promise you that if you don't leave this property right now, you're going to find out exactly what Cherokee hospitality looks like when it's been pushed too far. The standoff might have escalated into violence if not for an unexpected intervention." Dr. Harrison's ancient pickup truck came rumbling up the mountain road, followed by two other vehicles. The elderly physician climbed out slowly, his weathered face taking in the tense scene with practiced calm. "Harold," he said to the mayor, "what in the Sam Hill do you think you're doing?" Mayor Caldwell looked flustered by the doctor's arrival. "Doc, this doesn't concern you." "It concerns me plenty when half my patients are acting like damn fools on a mountain." Dr. Harrison walked directly to Sophia and Thomas, ignoring the hostile crowd. "Congratulations on your wedding. I brought a gift." He handed Sophia a small wrapped package, his gesture clearly intended to show which side he was on. Behind him, two other cars had disgorged their passengers. Mrs. Chen from the Chinese restaurant, old Pete Morrison from the gas station, and surprisingly, Jenny Walsh from the grocery store. "We heard there might be trouble," Mrs. Chen said, her accent thick but her meaning clear. "Thought you might need friends." The arrival of unexpected allies shifted the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Suddenly, the group from Cedar Falls found themselves outnumbered and facing people they had to live and work with every day. "This is ridiculous," Mayor Caldwell blustered. "We're trying to protect this community from outside influences, and you're taking their side?" "I'm taking the side of decent people," Dr. Harrison replied firmly. "Something you might try sometime, Harold." Jenny Walsh, who had been avoiding eye contact with Sophia for weeks, stepped forward nervously. "I wanted to apologize," she said quietly, "for how I've been acting. It wasn't right." The simple gesture of reconciliation seemed to deflate much of the hostility from the Cedar Falls group. Several people began muttering among themselves, and a few started drifting back toward their vehicles. Frank Miller, however, wasn't ready to give up. "This isn't over," he said, pointing an accusatory finger at Thomas. "You can't just come into our town and turn everything upside down." "I didn't come to your town," Thomas replied calmly. "I came to my land. There's a difference." "We'll see." "About that," Frank shot back. "Courts, lawyers, whatever it takes. You people aren't just going to waltz in here and—" "Frank," Dr. Harrison interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had delivered half the babies in Cedar Falls, including Frank himself. "Go home. You're embarrassing yourself." The older man's words carried enough weight to finally break the back of the organized resistance. One by one, the members of the Cedar Falls delegation began returning to their vehicles, muttering complaints, but lacking the will to continue the confrontation. Derek Caldwell was the last to leave, his parting words aimed directly at Sophia. "This isn't over. You'll regret choosing them over us." As the convoy of vehicles disappeared down the mountain road, an awkward silence settled over the remaining group. The wedding celebration that had been so joyful just an hour earlier now felt fragile and uncertain. "I'm sorry that happened," Dr. Harrison said to the Cherokee family members. "Not everyone in Cedar Falls is like that." Agnes studied the elderly physician with interest. "You're the doctor who delivered Thomas when he was born on the reservation." Dr. Harrison looked surprised. "You remember that?" "I remember everything. You drove through a blizzard to help a Cherokee woman you'd never met because it was the right thing to do. Some things don't change." The connection between past and present seemed to ease the tension. As the evening wore on, the remaining guests, an unlikely mix of Cherokee family members and sympathetic Cedar Falls residents, found common ground in their shared concern for Thomas and Sophia. Mrs. Chen insisted on cooking for everyone, producing containers of food from her car, as if she had been planning a party all along. Pete Morrison regaled the group with stories of the early days in Cedar Falls, when tensions between different communities were even more pronounced than they were now. "Change comes slow to places like this," he told Agnes as they sat around the fire pit. "But it does come eventually." "Sometimes it needs a push," Agnes replied, glancing meaningfully at Thomas and Sophia. As the evening wound down and the unexpected guests began to leave, Dr. Harrison pulled Sophia aside for a private conversation. "I wanted you to know," he said quietly, "that there are more people in town who support you than you might think. They're just afraid to speak up right now." "Afraid of what?" "Afraid of being different. Afraid of standing out. Afraid of being next." Dr. Harrison's weathered face was serious. "But fear passes. What you and Thomas have, that's the kind of thing that changes minds over time. What if it doesn't? What if this hostility just gets worse?" Dr. Harrison smiled. "Then you'll handle it. You're stronger than you know, Sophia. You always have been." After the last guest had departed, Thomas and Sophia found themselves alone on the porch of their new home. The evening had been emotionally exhausting, swinging from joy to confrontation to unexpected support, and back again. "Are you having second thoughts?" Thomas asked, echoing the question he had posed weeks earlier. Sophia considered her answer, and carefully. The evening had shown her exactly what they were up against. Not just individual prejudice, but institutional resistance, legal challenges, and the possibility of ongoing harassment. "No," she said finally. "If anything, tonight convinced me we made the right choice." "How do you figure?" "Because we found out who our real friends are, and because we proved we can handle whatever they throw at us." Thomas took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "It's not going to be easy. Nothing worthwhile ever is." Sophia turned to face him fully. "But we're not the same people. We were when this started. I'm not the scared woman who ate alone in the corner of the diner, and you're not the isolated man building houses for ghosts." "What are we now?" Sophia smiled, feeling the truth of her words as she spoke them. "We're a family. We're a team. We're people who build things that last." Over the following weeks, the confrontation on their wedding night proved to be a turning point rather than an escalation. The legal challenges Mayor Caldwell had threatened never materialized, partly because the tribal land claim was legitimate, and partly because several prominent Cedar Falls residents quietly discouraged further harassment. Thomas's custom furniture business began to take off almost immediately. Word of his craftsmanship spread through the region's wealthy communities, and orders began pouring in faster than he could fill them. Sophia proved to have a natural talent for customer relations and business management, handling the financial side of the operation, while Thomas focused on the creative work. Their first major commission came from an unexpected source, a wealthy ranch owner in Bozeman who stood 6 feet 6 inches tall himself and had grown tired of furniture that didn't fit his frame. The dining room set Thomas created for him was featured in a regional magazine, leading to a flood of new orders. "Seems like there are more of us tall folks out there than anyone realized," Sophia observed as she organized the growing stack of commission requests. "Market demand," Thomas replied with a grin. "Maybe we should start a whole business catering to people who don't fit the standard sizes." The idea took root and grew into something bigger than either of them had imagined. Within 6 months, they were fielding orders from across the western United States. Thomas hired 2 assistants, both Cherokee men from the reservation, who needed work, and Sophia established relationships with shipping companies and interior designers. But the real victory came on a Tuesday morning in late spring, almost a year after their wedding. Sophia was in town picking up supplies when she encountered a familiar face at Miller's Hardware. Frank Miller looked older, his hair grayer and his shoulders more stooped. When he saw Sophia, his expression shifted through several emotions before settling on something that might have been regret. "Sophia," he said quietly, "how are you?" "I'm well, Frank. Business is good." Frank nodded, looking uncomfortable. "I heard about that article in the magazine, about Thomas's furniture business." "It's been a blessing." They stood in awkward silence for a moment before Frank cleared his throat. "I owe you an apology for the things I said, the way I acted. You were always a good employee, and I let fear make me say things I didn't mean." Sophia studied his face, looking for signs of insincerity, but finding only genuine remorse. "Fear of what, Frank?" "Fear of change, I guess. Fear of being left behind." Frank's voice was barely above a whisper. "This town's been dying for years, young people leaving, businesses closing. When Thomas showed up and you left with him, it felt like we were losing another piece of what made this place home." "But I was never really part of that, was I?" "Not the way you wanted your community to be." Frank had the grace to look ashamed. "No, you weren't, and that was our loss, not yours." The conversation might have ended there, but Frank surprised her by continuing. "I was wondering, does Thomas ever need any specialized hardware for his projects? Custom hinges, unusual fasteners, that sort of thing?" Sophia felt a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "He might. Why don't you put together a catalog of what you can source, and I'll show it to him?" "I'd appreciate that. And Sophia, I'm glad you're happy. You deserve that." As Sophia drove back up the mountain with her supplies and an unexpected peace offering from her former boss, she reflected on how much had changed in just 1 year. The house Thomas had built for her had become the foundation for a life neither of them could have imagined when they first met. That evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Thomas voiced what they were both thinking. "Your Aunt Patricia was wrong," he said quietly. "About what?" "She said this would end badly for you." Thomas gestured toward the thriving workshop, the stack of orders waiting to be filled, the peaceful home they had built together. "This doesn't look like a bad ending to me." Sophia leaned against his shoulder, marveling as always at the simple pleasure of being with someone who made her feel perfectly sized. "It's not an ending at all. It's just the beginning." 2 years into their marriage, Sophia Blackhorse received a phone call that would test everything she and Thomas had built together. She was in the workshop, carefully sanding a custom entertainment center for a client in Jackson Hole, when her cell phone rang with an unfamiliar number. "Is this Sophia Blackhorse?" The voice was crisp, professional, with a slight New York accent. "Yes, this is Sophia. My name is Rebecca Martinez, and I'm a producer for Home and Design Network. I'm calling about a story we'd like to do on your husband's furniture business." Sophia set down her sandpaper, her heart suddenly racing. "What kind of story?" "We're developing a series called Craftsmen of America, featuring artisans who are preserving traditional techniques while serving modern markets. Your husband's work caught our attention through that piece in Mountain Living magazine." The conversation that followed was surreal. Rebecca explained that the network wanted to film a 30-minute segment about Thomas's furniture business, focusing on his Cherokee woodworking techniques and the unique market they had discovered for oversized furniture. The exposure could transform their small mountain operation into a national brand. "There's one thing," Rebecca added before ending the call. "Our research team discovered the story of how you two met, about the house he built for you. That human interest angle could really make this segment special. Would you both be willing to tell that story on camera?" After Sophia hung up, she sat in the workshop for a long time, surrounded by the smell of wood shavings and the gentle sounds of Thomas working in the adjoining room. The offer represented everything they had dreamed of: recognition, financial security, the chance to share Cherokee craftsmanship with a wider audience. But it also meant exposing their most personal story to millions of strangers. That evening, she presented the opportunity to Thomas over dinner. He listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful but unreadable. "What do you think?" she asked when she finished. "I think it's your decision as much as mine," Thomas replied carefully. "You're the one who'll have to relive all those painful memories from Cedar Falls. Those memories don't have power over me anymore." "Are you sure about that?" Sophia considered the question honestly. The past 2 years had been transformative, but she couldn't deny that some wounds still felt tender. The idea of having her story dissected by television producers and judged by viewers across the country was daunting. "I'm sure about us," she said finally. "And I'm sure that our story might help other people who feel like they don't fit anywhere." Thomas reached across the table to take her hand. "Then we do it. But we do it our way, with our conditions." The negotiations with the network took several weeks. Thomas insisted on approval rights over the final edit, and Sophia demanded that a portion of the proceeds go to a scholarship fund for Cherokee students pursuing technical trades. Rebecca Martinez proved to be surprisingly accommodating, perhaps recognizing that authenticity couldn't be manufactured. The filming began in early fall, when the Montana mountains were ablaze with autumn colors. The production crew was smaller than Sophia had expected, just Rebecca, a cameraman named Paul, and a sound technician called Miguel. They set up their equipment in the workshop and began documenting Thomas's process of creating a custom armor for a client in Seattle. "Tell me about the traditional techniques you use," Rebecca said, her camera operator capturing every detail of Thomas's work. "My grandfather taught me to read the grain of the wood," Thomas explained, running his hands over a piece of cherry lumber. "Each tree has its own personality, its own strengths and weaknesses. Cherokee woodworkers believe you don't impose your will on the wood. You collaborate with it." As the day progressed, Sophia found herself relaxing around the cameras. Rebecca was skilled at making her subjects feel comfortable, and the crew was respectful of both their space and their story. The real test came when Rebecca asked them to tell the story of how they met. Sophia had been dreading this moment. afraid that the pain and humiliation she had felt in those early days would come flooding back. But as she began to speak, something unexpected happened. "I spent 26 years believing I was a mistake," she said, looking directly into the camera. "Too tall, too awkward, too different to ever find love or acceptance. But Thomas didn't see a mistake when he looked at me. He saw someone worth building a life with." The words came easily, without the shame or embarrassment she had anticipated. Thomas picked up the story, describing his decision to build the house and his growing feelings for Sophia. When they reached the part about their wedding and the confrontation with the townspeople, Sophia felt a surge of pride rather than pain. "We learned that day who our real family was," she said. "And it wasn't the people who had known us longest. It was the people who accepted us completely." Rebecca's questions were thoughtful and respectful, never pushing for more drama than the story naturally contained. When she asked about the current state of their relationship with Cedar Falls, Thomas and Sophia exchanged a meaningful look. "Change comes slowly to small towns," Sophia said diplomatically, "but it does come. We have friends there now who we didn't have before." The filming wrapped after 3 days, and Rebecca promised to send them a rough cut for approval within a month. As the production crew packed up their equipment, Sophia felt a strange mixture of relief and anticipation. They had shared their story with honesty and dignity, but the real test would come when it aired on national television. The episode was scheduled to broadcast in December, during the network's holiday programming block. In the weeks leading up to the air date, Sophia found herself alternating between excitement and anxiety. Thomas, characteristically, seemed unperturbed by the approaching exposure. "Whatever happens, happens," he said when Sophia voiced her concerns for the 100th time. "We told the truth. That's all we can control." The night the episode aired, they gathered at Agnes's house on the reservation to watch with the extended Cherokee family. The living room was packed with cousins, aunts, uncles, and family friends, all curious to see how Thomas and Sophia's story would be presented to the world. When the opening credits rolled and Thomas's voice filled the room, explaining Cherokee woodworking traditions, a cheer went up from the assembled family. But it was the segment about their relationship that truly moved the room to silence. Watching their story unfold on national television was surreal. The producers had woven together their interviews with beautiful footage of the house, the workshop, and the Montana landscape. The narrative arc was clear and compelling. Two people who had been rejected by conventional society, finding love and success by embracing their differences. "She's beautiful," one of Thomas's young cousins whispered when Sophia appeared on screen. "And so tall," Agnes nodded approvingly. "Good story, true story." The response to the broadcast exceeded their wildest expectations. Within hours of the episode airing, their business phone was ringing constantly, with orders from across the country. Their website crashed under the traffic load, and Sophia's email inbox filled with messages from viewers sharing their own stories. Of feeling like outsiders, one message particularly touched her heart. It was from a teenage girl in Florida who wrote, "I'm 6'2", and everyone at school calls me a freak. Seeing your story made me think maybe being different isn't the worst thing in the world. Maybe someone will build me a house with high ceilings. Someday too." But the most unexpected response came from Cedar Falls itself. 3 days after the broadcast, Sophia received a call from an unfamiliar number with a local area code. "Sophia, this is Janet Williams from the Cedar Falls Chamber of Commerce." Sophia knew Janet by reputation. She was a relative newcomer to town who had been trying to revitalize the local economy for several years. "We watched your episode," Janet continued, "and frankly, we're embarrassed by how our town was portrayed. We'd like to do something to make amends." The conversation that followed was both surprising and gratifying. Janet explained that several prominent business owners had approached the chamber about honoring Thomas and Sophia's success. They wanted to present them with a key to the city and declare a Black Horse Day to celebrate their contributions to the region's economy. I understand if you're not interested, Janet said carefully, given the history. Sophia found herself smiling. We'll consider it, but we have some conditions. 2 weeks later, Thomas and Sophia drove down from their mountain home to attend the most unusual town celebration in Cedar Falls history. The ceremony was held in the community center where Thomas had first confronted the hostile town meeting, but the atmosphere couldn't have been more different. Mayor Caldwell had been voted out of office the previous year, replaced by a younger woman named Sarah Chen, Mrs. Chen's daughter, who had returned from college with ideas about economic development and community inclusion. She presented Thomas and Sophia with an ornate key to the city, her speech focusing on the importance of embracing diversity and supporting local entrepreneurs. Thomas and Sophia Blackhorse represent the best of what our community can achieve. When we choose acceptance over fear, Sarah said to the packed auditorium, their success is our success, and their story is now part of Cedar Falls' story. The crowd's response was enthusiastic, though Sophia noticed several familiar faces were absent. Derek Caldwell had left town months earlier, and a few of the more vocal opponents of their marriage had chosen not to attend, but the majority of the audience seemed genuinely pleased to celebrate their success. Frank Miller approached them during the reception that followed. He looked healthier than he had in years, and his smile seemed genuine. I wanted you to know, he said quietly, that your business has helped mine too. All these orders for specialized hardware, it's given me a reason to stay open instead of retiring. I'm glad to hear that, Frank. There's something else. Frank glanced around nervously before continuing. I've been getting calls from other towns. People wanting to know how Cedar Falls produced such successful entrepreneurs. Your story is bringing positive attention to this place for the first time in decades. The irony wasn't lost on Sophia. The same community that had once treated her as an embarrassment was now claiming her success as their own, but she found she wasn't bitter about it. Change, as Agnes had often said, came slowly to small places. The evening's most meaningful moment came when Doc Harrison stood up to address the crowd. The elderly physician had to use a walker now, but his voice was still strong and clear. I've lived in this town for 73 years, he said, and I've seen a lot of changes, some good, some not so good, but the best change I've witnessed is watching this community learn to celebrate what makes us different instead of fearing it. He turned to look directly at Thomas and Sophia. These two young people taught us that strength comes from accepting each other, not from making everyone fit the same mold. That's a lesson this old doctor needed to learn, and I'm grateful they were patient enough to teach it. The applause that followed was warm and sustained. As Sophia looked around the room, she saw faces that had once regarded her with suspicion, or pity now looking at her with respect and even admiration. It wasn't the acceptance she had once desperately craved. It was something better. It was recognition earned through perseverance and success. After the ceremony, Thomas and Sophia drove back up to their mountain home in comfortable silence. The lights of Cedar Falls grew smaller in the rearview mirror until they disappeared, entirely, leaving only the dark outline of the mountains against the star-filled sky. How do you feel about all that? Thomas asked as they pulled into their driveway. Sophia considered the question as they walked up the path to their front door. The house Thomas had built for her still took her breath away every time she saw it, especially at night when the windows glowed with warm light against the mountain darkness. I feel like we came full circle, she said finally. But we're not. The same people who started this journey. No, we're not. Thomas unlocked the door and held it open for her. We're better. Inside their home, surrounded by the furniture Thomas had crafted and the life they had built together, Sophia reflected on the strange turns their story had taken. The television episode had brought them fame and fortune beyond their dreams, but more importantly, it had forced their old community to confront its own prejudices and grow. As they prepared for bed, Sophia caught sight of herself in the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at her stood tall and confident, her shoulders square and her head held high. She was the same height she had always been, but she no longer carried herself like someone apologizing for existing. "Thank you," she said quietly as Thomas brushed his teeth beside her. "For what? For seeing me when I couldn't see myself, for building me a house with high ceilings, for teaching me that being different isn't the same as being wrong." Thomas rinsed his mouth and turned to face her fully. "You taught me something too." "What's that?" "That sometimes the best thing you can build isn't made of wood and nails. Sometimes it's made of love and patience and the courage to be exactly who you are." As they settled into their custom-made bed under Agnes's wedding quilt, Sophia thought about the teenage girl in Florida who had written to her. Tomorrow, she decided, she would write back with a longer response. She would tell her about the importance of standing tall, about finding people who celebrate your differences instead of just tolerating them, and about the possibility that, somewhere out there, someone might be waiting to build you a house with high ceilings. But tonight, she was content to lie beside the man who had changed her life simply by refusing to see her height as a flaw. Outside their windows, the Montana mountains stood silent and eternal, keeping watch over a love story that had started with cruel laughter in a small town and had grown into something that touched hearts across the nation. In the morning there would be more orders to fill, more interviews to give, more opportunities to share their story and Cherokee craftsmanship with the world. But for now, there was just the quiet satisfaction of a dream that had exceeded every expectation, built one board at a time by a man who understood that sometimes the most important construction project is building someone's confidence back, from the ground up. 5 years after their television appearance transformed their lives, Sophia Blackhorse stood before a mirror in a Denver hotel room, adjusting the collar of her business suit. Today marked another milestone in their unexpected journey. She was about to address the National Conference on Adaptive Design, speaking to architects and designers from across the country about creating spaces for people who didn't fit standard measurements. The invitation had come from Dr. Patricia Yamamoto, a renowned architect who specialized in accessible design. She had seen the Home and Design Network episode and been inspired by Thomas's approach to building for different body types. What started as a conversation about furniture had evolved into something much larger, a movement toward truly inclusive design. "You ready for this?" Thomas asked, emerging from the bathroom in his own carefully tailored suit. Even after all these years, finding clothes that fit his 7-foot frame remained a challenge, though their success had allowed them to afford custom tailoring. "I think so," Sophia replied, though her stomach churned with nervous energy. Speaking at hardware stores and furniture exhibitions was one thing. Addressing a room full of PhD architects was quite another. Their business had evolved far beyond custom furniture. What had started as Thomas handcrafting pieces in their mountain workshop had grown into Blackhorse Adaptive Design, a company that consulted on everything from residential renovations to public buildings. They employed 12 people now, including several Cherokee craftsmen and 2 design graduates who had sought them out specifically because of their inclusive philosophy. The conference hall was packed with hundreds of professionals, all eager to hear from the couple who had accidentally pioneered a new approach to spatial design. As Sophia took the stage, she could see faces of all ages and ethnicities, many showing the same mixture of curiosity and skepticism she remembered from her early days in Cedar Falls. "How many of you have ever felt too big for the space you were in?" she began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. A scattered show of hands went up, mostly from taller attendees. How many have felt too small? More hands joined the first group. Now, how many of you have designed buildings where everyone fits comfortably? The question hung in the air as hands slowly lowered. Sophia smiled, remembering her own awakening to this issue years earlier. My husband built me a house because I had never lived in a space designed for someone my height. That act of love accidentally revealed a massive gap in how we think about human-centered design. We assume average measurements work for everyone, but average is just a mathematical construct. Real people come in every possible variation. She clicked to her first slide, showing before and after photos of a kitchen renovation they had completed for a family in Colorado. The parents were both over 6.5 feet tall, while their adopted daughter was a little person. The original kitchen had been unusable for everyone except the theoretical average person who had never actually lived there. Traditional. Design asks people to adapt to spaces, Sophia continued. Adaptive design asks for spaces to accommodate people. It's not just about accessibility for disabilities. It's about recognizing that human diversity is normal and our built environment should reflect that. Thomas joined her on stage for the technical portion of their presentation. He demonstrated adjustable height countertops, modular shelving systems, and furniture that could be reconfigured for different users. But the heart of their message went beyond mechanisms and measurements. In Cherokee tradition, Thomas explained, we believe that every person brings unique gifts to the community. A good village creates space for everyone to contribute their strengths. Our buildings should work the same way. The audience response was overwhelmingly positive. During the question and answer period, architects shared their own struggles with standard building codes that didn't account for human variation. A designer from Portland asked about retrofitting existing structures. A professor from Chicago wanted to know if they offered consulting services for educational institutions. But the question that stopped Sophia short came from a young woman in the back of the auditorium who stood up slowly, revealing that she was exceptionally tall, even while seated. I'm a first-year architecture student, the woman said, her voice barely audible over the microphone. I love design, but I've been told I should consider other fields because clients won't take me seriously. How do you deal with being the thing you're trying to solve? The question hit Sophia like a physical blow. She saw herself 20 years earlier in that young woman's uncertainty, the way she hunched her shoulders slightly, as if trying to take up less space, even while asking for advice. What's your name? Sophia asked gently. Rachel Morrison. Rachel. Can you stand up for me? The young woman rose to her full height, easily 6 feet 4 inches, and Sophia heard the familiar rustle of an audience unconsciously reacting to someone who broke their expectations. Look around this room, Sophia said, her voice growing stronger. Every person here is looking at you right now, not because you're a problem to be solved, but because you represent the future of inclusive design. You understand spatial challenges in a way that most architects never will. You're not the thing that needs to be fixed. You're the person who can fix things for others. She paused, letting her words sink in. I spent 26 years thinking my height was a disability, but it's actually my greatest professional asset. I understand what it feels like when spaces don't work, which makes me better at designing spaces that do work. Your height isn't an obstacle to your career, it's your competitive advantage. The applause that followed was thunderous. Rachel remained standing, tears streaming down her face as hundreds of professionals rose to their feet in recognition of both her potential and Sophia's journey. After the conference, Sophia and Thomas were approached by Dr. Yamamoto with an unexpected proposition. She represented a consortium of universities developing a new graduate program in adaptive design, and they wanted the Black Horses to help establish the curriculum. We're not academics, Thomas pointed out. We're practical people who solve practical problems. Exactly why we need you, Dr. Yamamoto replied. Academic theory without real-world application is just intellectual exercise. You've proven these concepts work in the marketplace. The conversation continued over dinner, joined by professors from 5 different universities and representatives from 2 major architectural firms. By the end of the evening, Sophia found herself agreeing to serve as a visiting lecturer, while Thomas would lead hands-on workshops in traditional and adaptive craftsmanship. The drive back to Montana gave them time to process the magnitude of what they were undertaking. Their small furniture business had evolved into something neither of them had ever imagined, a platform for changing how society thought about space and belonging. "Are we getting in over our heads?" Sophia asked, as they crossed into Montana, the familiar peaks of the Rockies coming into view. "Probably," Thomas replied with a grin, "but we've been over our heads since the day I decided to build you a house. Seems to be working out so far." Their return home brought them back to the mountain property that had started it all. The original house was still there, still perfectly suited to their needs, but the surrounding land now hosted a workshop complex that employed their growing team. Young Cherokee craftsmen worked alongside recent design graduates, creating everything from custom furniture to architectural elements for major construction projects. Agnes, now in her 80s, but still sharp as a knife, had moved into a small apartment they built adjacent to the main house. She had become an unofficial grandmother to their employees, sharing traditional stories and keeping everyone grounded in the cultural values that informed their work. "You've been busy," she observed, as Sophia showed her photos from the Denver conference. "Building things that can't be measured in board feet." "What do you mean?" "You're building bridges between old ways and new ways, between different kinds of people, between what was and what could be." Agnes studied a photo of Rachel Morrison. "That young woman, she'll change things because you showed her she could." That prediction proved accurate sooner than anyone expected. 6 months later, Rachel transferred to the University of Colorado to join the new adaptive design program. She arrived for her first visit to the Black Horse workshop on a crisp autumn morning, accompanied by 3 other graduate students and their professor. Sophia watched from the office window as Thomas led the group through the workshop, explaining how traditional Cherokee joinery techniques could be adapted for modern furniture that needed to adjust to different users. Rachel took notes constantly, her enthusiasm evident in every gesture. "She reminds me of someone," Thomas said, joining Sophia at the window. "Who?" "You. When you first saw this place, that look of someone who's finally found where they belong." And the graduate program flourished, with students coming from around the world to study adaptive design principles. The Black Horse workshop became an unofficial laboratory where theoretical concepts were tested in real-world applications. Students worked alongside Cherokee craftsmen, learning not just technical skills, but the philosophical approach that informed all their work. One project particularly captured Sophia's imagination. A team of students was designing a community center for a neighborhood in Detroit that served people with diverse physical needs. Veterans with mobility challenges, families with children of various heights and abilities, elderly residents with different accessibility requirements. Traditional design would create separate spaces for different populations, Rachel explained during her final presentation. But the Black Horse approach suggests creating flexible spaces that can accommodate everyone simultaneously. The design she presented featured adjustable height work surfaces, modular seating that could be reconfigured for different activities, and sightlines that worked whether someone was standing, sitting, or using a wheelchair. But more than the technical elements, it embodied the philosophy Sophia and Thomas had stumbled upon, that diversity was a strength to be celebrated, not a problem to be managed. "This is what we always hoped would happen," Sophia told Thomas that evening as they reviewed Rachel's presentation materials. Someone taking our ideas and making them better, bigger, more inclusive than we ever imagined. Their influence was spreading in other directions as well. The Black Horse adaptive design approach had caught the attention of major corporations looking to create more inclusive workplaces. They consulted on office buildings in Seattle, manufacturing facilities in Detroit, and retail spaces in Atlanta. Each project taught them something new about the countless ways people needed spaces to work differently. But perhaps their most meaningful project came from an unexpected source: Cedar Falls itself. The town was planning a new community center to replace the aging building where Thomas had once faced a hostile crowd. The planning committee, now led by Sarah Chen, and including several other progressive voices, specifically requested Black Horse adaptive design to handle the project. "We want to build something that represents who we're becoming, not who we used to be," Sarah explained during their first meeting. "A space that welcomes everyone, regardless of size, age, ability, or background." The irony wasn't lost on anyone involved. The town that had once rejected Sophia for being different was now asking her to design a building that celebrated difference. But rather than feeling vindicated, Sophia found herself genuinely excited about the opportunity to give back to the community that had eventually learned to embrace change. The design process involved extensive community input. They held workshops where residents of all ages and abilities could experience mock-ups of different design elements. Children tested playground equipment, scaled for various sizes. Elderly residents evaluated seating options with different support levels. Parents with strollers navigated pathways of different widths. Thomas incorporated Cherokee design elements throughout the building, but in ways that felt integrated rather than appropriated. The main gathering space featured a traditional circular layout that encouraged community interaction, while the materials and colors reflected the Montana landscape that surrounded them. The groundbreaking ceremony took place on a sunny morning in late spring, with Agnes Blackhorse given the honor of turning the first shovel of earth. Media coverage of the event featured the remarkable transformation of Cedar Falls, from a town that had once driven out difference to one that was building a monument to inclusion. 20 years ago, I ate lunch alone every day because I didn't fit in the regular booths, Sophia told the assembled crowd. Today, we're building a place where fitting in means being exactly who you are. As construction progressed over the following months, the project became a source of community pride. Local businesses competed to contribute materials and labor. High school students volunteered to help with landscaping. Even some of the old-timers who had initially opposed Thomas and Sophia's relationship showed up to lend a hand. Frank Miller, now officially retired but still sharp and engaged, served as a volunteer coordinator for elderly residents who wanted to contribute to the project. His transformation from skeptic to ally had been gradual but complete, and he took obvious pride in introducing visitors to our local celebrities. The community center opened on the 5-year anniversary of Sophia and Thomas's television appearance, with a celebration that drew visitors from across the region. Rachel Morrison, now completing her graduate studies, attended as a special guest, along with several of her fellow students and professors. Dr. Yamamoto gave the keynote address, speaking about how the Black Horse approach to design was influencing projects around the world. What started as one man building a house for the woman he loved has become a movement that's changing how we think about human-centered design, she said. This building represents more than architecture. It represents hope. As the celebration continued into the evening, Sophia found herself standing in the main gathering space, watching children of all sizes play together, while their parents socialized in seating areas designed to accommodate everyone comfortably. The building hummed with activity and conversation, fulfilling exactly the vision they had hoped to achieve. "Penny for your thoughts," Thomas said, joining her in observing the scene. "I was thinking about that first night you brought me up to see the house frame," Sophia replied. "Did you ever imagine it would lead to all this?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, his gaze taking in the bustling community space they had helped create. "I imagined you being happy. Everything else has been a bonus." As they drove home that night, past the lights of a town that had learned to celebrate what made it unique, Sophia reflected on the unexpected turns their life had taken. What began as a personal love story had somehow become a professional mission, touching lives across the country and inspiring a new generation of designers to think differently about space and inclusion. The house Thomas had built for her still stood on their mountain property, still perfectly suited to their needs after all these years. But it was no longer just their home. It had become the seed of something much larger, a philosophy that was changing how people thought about belonging and acceptance. Tomorrow would bring new projects, new challenges, new opportunities to build bridges between what was and what could be. But tonight, there was just the quiet satisfaction of work well done and love well shared, set against the eternal backdrop of the Montana mountains that had witnessed their entire journey from rejection to acceptance to triumph. 10 years had passed since Thomas Blackhorse first walked into Miller's hardware store and changed Sophia's life forever. Now, as she stood in the arrivals area of Denver International Airport holding a sign that read "Morrison Family," she marveled at how completely their world had transformed. Rachel Morrison emerged from the gate with a confidence that reminded Sophia of her younger self, if her younger self had possessed unshakable self-assurance instead of crushing insecurity. Behind Rachel walked a tall, lanky teenager who could only be her younger brother, and a woman who was clearly their mother, all three of them moving with the easy grace of people who had never learned to apologize for their height. "Dr. Blackhorse," Rachel said, embracing Sophia warmly, "thank you so much for inviting us." "It's just Sophia, please, and thank you for coming all this way for the ceremony." Today marked the 10th anniversary of Blackhorse Adaptive Design, and the company was receiving the National Humanitarian Design Award from the American Institute of Architects. More importantly to Sophia, it marked the completion of their most ambitious project yet, a fully inclusive campus for a school that served children with diverse learning and physical needs. The Morrison family's presence at the celebration held special significance. Rachel had become the poster child for the new generation of adaptive designers, but her journey hadn't been without challenges. After graduating with highest honors from the University of Colorado's Adaptive Design program, she had faced skepticism from traditional architectural firms who questioned whether someone who looked like the problem could effectively serve diverse clients. "How did you handle the job interviews?" Sophia asked as they drove through Denver traffic toward the hotel. Rachel laughed, but there was steel underneath the humor. "I stopped trying to make myself smaller and started making my portfolio bigger. I brought examples of projects that could only have been designed by someone who understood spatial challenges firsthand. And now I have my own firm with 6 employees and a waiting list of clients. Turns out there's a huge market for designers who actually understand what they're solving for." Rachel's mother, Linda Morrison, spoke up from the back seat. She's being modest. Her firm just won the contract to redesign the student union at Colorado State University. Apparently, students there were complaining that the furniture was sized for middle schoolers. The conversation reminded Sophia of how far the adaptive design movement had come. What started as Thomas building custom furniture for unusually tall people had evolved into a comprehensive approach to inclusive environmental design that was being taught in universities across the country and implemented by major corporations. Worldwide, Their hotel overlooked the construction site of Rachel's latest project, a mixed-use development that would include retail spaces, offices, and residential units, all designed with adjustable features to accommodate users of different sizes and abilities. Sophia could see workers installing the signature Black Horse adjustable height systems that had become standard in progressive construction projects. "Sometimes I can't believe this all started because a Cherokee giant fell in love with a woman who was too tall for her town," Linda Morrison observed, studying the construction through the hotel window. "That's not how it started," Sophia corrected gently. "It started when someone decided that being different wasn't something to hide or fix. Everything else just grew from there." The awards ceremony took place that evening in a ballroom filled with the most influential architects and designers in North America. Sophia had attended dozens of such events over the years, but she still felt a flutter of nervous excitement as she and Thomas made their way to the head table. The presenter was Dr. Patricia Yamamoto, whose collaboration with the Black Horses had helped establish adaptive design as a legitimate academic discipline. Her introduction chronicled their journey from small-town furniture makers to international consultants whose work had influenced building codes in 12 countries. When Sophia and Thomas Blackhorse first appeared on television 10 years ago, viewers saw a heartwarming story about love conquering prejudice. Dr. Yamamoto said, "What they couldn't have known was that they were witnessing the birth of a movement that would fundamentally change how we think about the relationship between human bodies and built spaces." As Sophia rose to accept the award, she caught sight of familiar faces scattered throughout the audience. Agnes Blackhorse, now 88 but still formidable, sat at a table with other Cherokee family members who had made the trip to Denver. Dr. Harrison, approaching 90 himself, had insisted on attending despite his failing health. Even Frank Miller was there, having closed his hardware store early to make the drive with his wife. But it was the faces she didn't recognize that moved her most. Young architects and designers who had been inspired by their work, many of them clearly from diverse backgrounds that would have been excluded from traditional design circles just a generation earlier. "When I was 26 years old," Sophia began, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom, "I thought my greatest dream was to find a place where I fit, but I was thinking too small. The real dream wasn't about fitting into existing spaces. It was about creating new spaces where everyone could belong." She spoke about the evolution of their work, from those early custom furniture pieces to their current projects that were reshaping entire communities. But the heart of her speech focused on the young designers in the audience who would carry the movement forward. "Adaptive design isn't just about accommodating different body types," she explained. "It's about recognizing that human diversity is a strength, not a problem to be solved. When we design for the margins, we create better solutions for everyone." The standing ovation that followed lasted nearly 5 minutes. As Sophia and Thomas made their way back to their seats, she noticed tears in the eyes of several audience members, including Rachel Morrison, who was clearly thinking about her own journey from self-doubt to success. The celebration continued at a reception where Sophia found herself in conversation with architects from around the world who had implemented Black Horse principles in their own projects. A designer from Tokyo described an office building with workstations that could be adjusted for users, ranging from 4 feet to 7 feet tall. An urban planner from Sao Paulo explained how adaptive design concepts were being incorporated into public transportation systems. But the conversation that stayed with her came from an unexpected source. A high school student named Marcus Williams, who had somehow gained entry to the professional reception. "Excuse me, Dr. Blackhorse," he said nervously. "I hope you don't mind me coming up to you, but I saw your story on the internet and it changed my life." Marcus was clearly still growing, all elbows and knees, probably destined to be exceptionally tall, like his father, who stood protectively nearby. But unlike Sophia at that age, he carried himself with confidence rather than shame. "How did it change your life?" Sophia asked gently. I used to hate being tall. Kids at school called me names, and I tried to slouch all the time to look normal. But after I saw your documentary, I started thinking maybe being different could be useful instead of just embarrassing. And what did you decide to do about it? Marcus straightened to his full height, which was considerable for a 16-year-old. I'm designing a school project about adaptive sports equipment for our engineering class, equipment that works for people of all different sizes and abilities. My teacher says it's the most innovative project she's seen in 20 years of teaching. Sophia felt tears prick her eyes. This was exactly what she and Thomas had hoped for when they first shared their story. That young people would see being different as an asset rather than a liability. Marcus, she said, pulling a business card from her purse, I want you to apply for our summer internship program. We need young designers who understand these challenges from the inside. The next morning brought another significant moment. Sophia and Thomas drove to Boulder to visit the University of Colorado's Adaptive Design Institute, which had grown from Dr. Yamamoto's original program into a world-renowned research center. The institute's current director was someone Sophia hadn't expected to see again, Rachel Morrison, who had accepted the position just 6 months earlier at the remarkably young age of 32. I wanted to show you something, Rachel said, leading them through a laboratory filled with students working on various projects. This is our new community engagement lab, where students test their designs with real users before finalizing anything. In one corner, a team was working with elderly volunteers to refine a public seating system. In another, children of various sizes were testing playground equipment that could accommodate different developmental stages simultaneously. The energy in the room was electric, with students and community members collaborating as equals in the design process. This is what we always dreamed adaptive design could become, Thomas observed, watching a young Cherokee student explain traditional woodworking techniques to a group that included engineers, architects, and a woman using a wheelchair. And it's just the beginning, Rachel replied. We have partnership requests from universities on 6 continents. The principles you two pioneered are becoming standard practice in progressive design education worldwide. As they toured the institute, Sophia was struck by how naturally the students navigated differences in height, ability, age, and cultural background. The spaces themselves had been designed using Black Horse principles, with adjustable work surfaces, multiple seating options, and sightlines that worked for users of all sizes. But more importantly, the culture of the Institute embraced diversity as a creative advantage rather than a challenge to be managed. The final stop on their visit was the Institute's archive, where Rachel had preserved artifacts from the early days of adaptive design, including photos of the original house Thomas had built for Sophia and examples of their first custom furniture pieces. I wanted you to see this, Rachel said, leading them to a display case that contained a familiar object, the wedding quilt Agnes had made for them, now carefully preserved behind glass. How did you get this? Sophia asked, confused. Agnes's voice came from behind them. I donated it, figured it belonged somewhere people could learn from it. They turned to see Thomas's grandmother approaching with the aid of a walker, but moving with determination. She had insisted on making this a trip despite her age, claiming she wanted to see what all her children had accomplished. The quilt represents more than just your marriage, Agnes explained to the small group that had gathered. It represents the idea that when you weave different threads together carefully, you create something stronger than any individual piece. Could be alone, standing in that archive, surrounded by the artifacts of their journey and the evidence of its impact, Sophia felt a profound sense of completion. The scared, lonely woman who had once eaten by herself in the corner of a small-town diner had become someone whose story inspired young people around the world to embrace their differences as strengths. That evening, at a quiet dinner with just Their closest friends and family, Thomas raised his glass for a toast. 10 years ago I thought I was just building a house for the woman I loved, he said, his deep voice filled with emotion. I never imagined we were building a foundation for something that would touch so many lives. You didn't build it alone, Agnes pointed out firmly. Sophia built it too, by having the courage to say yes to something that seemed impossible. Dr. Harrison, frail but still mentally sharp, added his perspective. In my 75 years of practicing medicine, I've learned that healing usually starts with one person deciding to see things differently. You two changed how an entire profession thinks about space and belonging. As the evening wound down, Sophia found herself reflecting on the unexpected paths their life had taken. Tomorrow, they would fly back to Montana, to the mountain property, where it all began. There would be new projects waiting, new challenges to solve, new young designers to mentor. But tonight, she was content to sit beside the man who had seen her as she truly was, when she couldn't see it herself, surrounded by the extended family they had gathered along the way. The original house, with its high ceilings and wide doorways, still stood on their property, still perfectly suited to their needs. But it was no longer just a home. It had become a symbol of what was possible when people chose love over fear, inclusion over exclusion, and hope over resignation. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't walked into Miller's Hardware that day? Sophia asked Thomas as they prepared to leave the restaurant. Thomas considered the question. Seriously, as he always did, I think we would have found each other eventually. Some connections are inevitable. You really believe that? I believe that when you're building something worthwhile, the right people show up at the right time. You were ready to be found, and I was ready to do the finding. As they walked back to their hotel through the Denver streets, Sophia caught their reflection in a storefront window. Two tall figures moving confidently through the world, no longer concerned with taking up too much space or standing out from the crowd. Behind them, she could see the lights of the city stretching toward the mountains, full of buildings that were slowly being transformed by the principles they had helped establish. The story that had begun with cruel laughter in a small Montana town had become something neither of them could have imagined, a movement that was changing how society thought about difference, belonging, and the spaces where human lives unfold. But at its heart, it remained what it had always been, a love story between two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed to become, who they were meant to be. The house Thomas built for Sophia still stood on their mountain, a testament to the power of seeing someone completely and loving them exactly as they are. But its true legacy wasn't made of wood and stone. It was made of the countless lives that had been touched by their example, the young people who now stood tall instead of slouching, and the communities that had learned to build spaces where everyone belonged. Some love stories change two lives. The best ones change the world, one thoughtfully designed space at a time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.